Everyone thought he was just another vagrant, until Detective Clara Pemberton locked eyes with him, and everything changed. She recognized the face beneath the grime. What had happened to him? Why was he there? And what secret had been buried so deeply no one dared to speak of it, until now? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The autumn rain had turned Boston's cobblestone streets into mirrors of gray sky, each puddle reflecting the somber mood that seemed to hang over the city like a funeral shroud. It was October 1897, and Detective Clara Pemberton stood beneath the stone archway of the Boston Public Library. Her dark green velvet coat dampened at the shoulders, despite her best efforts with an umbrella. The hem of her woolen skirt, a practical navy that allowed her more freedom of movement than the restrictive fashions demanded of most women, had collected mud from her morning walk through the common. Clara was 28 years old, though her sharp hazel eyes and the determined set of her jaw often made people assume she was older, more severe than her years warranted. Her chestnut hair was pinned up in the Gibson girl style that had recently become fashionable, though several strands had escaped their constraints and curled damply against her neck. She possessed the kind of beauty that revealed itself slowly, not in the flash of a smile, but in the intensity of her gaze, the elegant line of her profile, the graceful way she moved through the world as if claiming her right to occupy space that society insisted belonged only to men. She had been one of the first women hired by the Boston Police Department, a position she had fought for with every ounce of determination in her being. Chief Inspector Malcolm Thorne had been reluctant to take her on, but a series of cases involving women who would only speak to another woman had forced his hand. Now, 3 years into her tenure, Clara had proven herself more than capable, though she still felt the weight of scrutiny every time she entered the precinct on Berkeley Street. This particular morning, Clara had been tasked with following up on a routine matter, a complaint from the library about a vagrant who had been sleeping on the front steps for the past week. The librarians reported that he frightened some of the patrons, particularly the elderly ladies who came to browse the reading rooms. It was the sort of mundane assignment that rankled Clara, who knew it was given to her precisely because it was considered insignificant. The male detectives were investigating a warehouse fire on the docks, while she was sent to shoo away a beggar. As she approached the library's main entrance, Clara noticed him immediately. He sat hunched against one of the massive stone columns, his body curled into itself as if trying to disappear. His clothes were filthy, a tattered brown coat that might once have been fine wool, trousers that were more patches than original fabric, and boots so worn that she could see his stockinged feet through the holes. A shapeless hat, pulled low over his face, obscured his features. Beside him sat a battered tin cup, empty save for a few copper pennies. Most people walked past without a glance. Boston was full of unfortunates, men who had lost everything in the financial panic of 1893 and never recovered. The city's charitable institutions were overwhelmed, and many ended up on the streets, invisible to the prosperous citizens who hurried past on their way to important business. Clara had started to approach, her words of gentle but firm dismissal already forming in her mind, when something made her pause. The man's hands, she noticed, were not the gnarled, weathered hands of someone who had lived rough for years. Despite the dirt, they appeared well-formed, almost refined. And there was something about the way he held himself, even in his defeated posture, that suggested breeding, education, a life that had once been very different. She moved closer, her footsteps quiet on the wet stone. "Sir," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "I'm Detective Pemberton with the Boston Police. I need to speak with you." The man didn't move. For a moment Clara wondered if he might be ill or worse. Then, slowly, he raised his head, and she found herself looking into a pair of blue eyes so startling in their clarity that she took an involuntary step back. Even through the grime and the week's worth of beard growth, even through the hollowness of his cheeks and the bruising beneath his eyes that spoke of hunger and sleepless nights, Clara recognized him. Recognition hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart hammer against her ribs. "Theodore?" she whispered, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Theodore Blackwell?" The man's eyes widened in surprise. Then something like shame flickered across his features. He looked away, down at his ruined boots, as if he couldn't bear to meet her gaze. "Clara Hartwell," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse but still carrying the educated cadence she remembered. Or I suppose it's Detective Pemberton now. I read about your appointment in the newspapers. Before, he gestured vaguely at himself, at his current circumstances. Clara's mind was reeling. Theodore Blackwell had been one of Boston's most promising young attorneys, a man from an old and respected family who had graduated from Harvard Law School at the top of his class. More than that, he had been her friend, perhaps her only true friend during those difficult years when she had been fighting to join the police force. They had met at a lecture series at the Athenaeum, both drawn to a talk on criminal justice reform. Theodore had been one of the few men who had taken her ambitions seriously, who had encouraged her rather than dismissed her dreams as feminine folly. That had been 5 years ago, and then suddenly, Theodore had disappeared. There had been whispers, rumors of some kind of scandal, but the Blackwell family had closed ranks and refused to speak of it. Theodore's father, Judge Harrison Blackwell, had been a formidable figure in Boston's legal circles, and whatever had happened had been buried so deeply that even Clara, with her police connections, had been unable to uncover the truth. She had tried to find Theodore, had made inquiries, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. After a while, she had convinced herself that he must have left Boston, started a new life somewhere far from the weight of his family's expectations. And now here he was, not gone at all, but reduced to begging on the steps of the very library where they used to meet to discuss philosophy and law. "Theodore, what happened?" Clara asked, her professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine concern. She glanced around, aware that they were attracting attention from passers-by. A well-dressed woman detective speaking with a beggar was unusual enough to warrant stares. "Please, let me help you. There must be something I can do." Theodore shook his head, a bitter smile playing at his cracked lips. "There's nothing anyone can do, Clara. I'm exactly where I deserve to be, where I've been sentenced to be." "Sentenced?" Clara seized on the word. "Theodore, are you in some kind of trouble? Legal trouble?" Before he could answer, a sharp voice cut through the damp morning air. "Detective Pemberton, what is taking so long? I trust you are removing this vagrant from the premises immediately." Clara turned to see Mrs. Agatha Whitmore, one of the library's most officious board members, standing in the doorway. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, dressed in black silk that rustled with her indignation, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid hours to achieve. Mrs. Whitmore was exactly the sort of woman who saw people like Theodore as problems to be swept away, rather than human beings in need of compassion. "I'm handling the situation, Mrs. Whitmore," Clara replied, keeping her voice level and professional despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Please return to your duties and allow me to attend to mine." Mrs. Whitmore's face flushed with displeasure. "I will be speaking to Chief Inspector Thorne about your attitude, young woman. This is precisely why women have no place in police work. Too much emotion, not enough practical action." Clara bit back the retort that sprang to her lips. Antagonizing one of Boston's most influential society matrons would do nothing to help her position, and it certainly wouldn't help Theodore. Instead, she simply nodded and turned her attention back to the man huddled before her. Once Mrs. Whitmore had disappeared back inside the library in a rustle of affronted dignity, Clara crouched down so she was at eye level with Theodore. This close, she could see how truly desperate his circumstances were. His lips were chapped and bleeding, his skin had a grayish cast that spoke of malnutrition, and there was a tremor in his hands that worried her deeply. "When did you last eat?" she asked gently. Theodore wouldn't meet her eyes. "I don't remember. Yesterday, perhaps. A kind merchant gave me some bread that was going stale." Clara made a decision. Regulations and propriety could go hang themselves. She wasn't going to leave an old friend suffering on the street, no matter what scandal might have brought him to this state. "Get up," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You're coming with me." "Clara, I can't." "That wasn't a request, Mr. Blackwell. As an officer of the law, I'm removing you from these premises. You can cooperate, or I can arrest you for vagrancy. Your choice." A ghost of a smile crossed Theodore's face, the first genuine emotion she had seen from him. "Still as stubborn as ever, I see. Some things never change." "Some things do," Clara replied, thinking of how much she had changed, how much she had fought and struggled to become the woman she was now. "But not everything. Now come on, before Mrs. Whitmore returns with reinforcements." Theodore struggled to his feet, his movements slow and pained. Clara noticed him wince as he straightened, as if his ribs hurt. Had someone beaten him? Her detective's mind immediately began cataloging details, looking for signs of injury, for clues to what had brought him to this desperate state. She offered him her arm, and after a moment's hesitation, he took it. Together they walked down the library steps and out into the rain-soaked streets of Boston. Clara was acutely aware of the stares they attracted, a respectably dressed woman detective with a filthy beggar clinging to her arm. She ignored them all, her chin raised, her gaze forward, daring anyone to comment. "Where are we going?" Theodore asked as they turned onto Boylston Street, heading away from the fashionable neighborhoods and toward the more modest areas where Clara kept her rooms. "Somewhere you can get cleaned up and have a proper meal," Clara replied. "And then, Theodore Blackwell, you are going to tell me everything, every detail of what happened to you, no matter how painful or shameful you think it might be. Do you understand?" Theodore was quiet for a long moment, and Clara thought he might refuse. But then he nodded, a gesture so small she almost missed it. "I understand," he said quietly. "Though I warn you, Clara, once you know the truth, you may wish you had simply followed Mrs. Whitmore's instructions and sent me on my way. Some secrets are better left buried." "I'll be the judge of that," Clara said firmly. "I'm a detective, Theodore. Uncovering secrets is what I do." As they walked through the rain, Clara felt the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. Whatever had happened to Theodore Blackwell, whatever scandal or tragedy had reduced him from a promising young attorney to a beggar on library steps, it was clearly something dark and terrible. But Clara had never been one to shy away from darkness. If anything, she had spent her entire career walking deliberately into it, seeking truth and justice where others feared to tread. She glanced sideways at the man beside her, at the proud bearing that persisted despite his reduced circumstances, at the intelligence that still shone in those remarkable blue eyes despite everything he had endured. Theodore Blackwell had once been tall and strong, with the athletic build of a man who rode on the Charles River and played tennis at his club. Even now, beneath the layers of grime and starvation, she could see hints of that physicality, the broad shoulders and long limbs that spoke of what he had once been. And Clara, despite her professional detachment, despite the rules she knew she was already breaking by becoming personally involved in what should have been a simple vagrancy case, felt something stir in her chest. Recognition, yes, but something more. A sense that their lives had just become entangled in ways she couldn't yet foresee, that finding Theodore again after all these years was not mere coincidence but fate, destiny, or whatever one chose to call the invisible forces that sometimes brought people together at exactly the moment when they needed each other most. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, and Clara Pemberton walked on with Theodore Blackwell at her side, neither of them knowing yet what mysteries and dangers lay ahead, what truths would be uncovered, what price they would pay for seeking justice in a city where power and privilege could bury any scandal deep enough. Clara's lodgings were located on a quiet street in the South End, in a modest brick building that housed several other working women, a schoolteacher, a seamstress, and a bookkeeper for a textile company. It was respectable enough to preserve her reputation but affordable on a detective's salary, which was considerably less than what her male counterparts earned. The landlady, Mrs. Josephine Burke, was a widow who had learned not to ask too many questions about the unusual hours Clara kept, or the occasional visitors she brought home in connection with her cases. Still, even Mrs. Burke raised an eyebrow when Clara arrived with Theodore in tow. The older woman was sweeping the front hallway when they entered, and her gaze traveled from Clara's determined face to Theodore's bedraggled appearance with obvious concern. "Detective Pemberton," Mrs. Burke said carefully, her Irish accent still thick despite 30 years in Boston. "Is everything quite all right?" "Perfectly fine, Mrs. Burke," Clara replied with more confidence than she felt. "This is Mr. Blackwell, an old acquaintance who has fallen on difficult times. I'll be providing him with some assistance. Nothing improper, I assure you. Simply Christian charity." Mrs. Burke's expression softened slightly. She was a religious woman who attended Mass every Sunday and believed firmly in helping those less fortunate. "Will the gentleman be needing hot water for a bath? I can have my son Michael heat some kettles." "That would be most appreciated," Clara said gratefully. "And perhaps some soup if you have any to spare? I've a pot of beef and vegetable on the stove. I'll bring some up directly." Mrs. Burke looked at Theodore with something approaching pity. "You're safe here, young man. Miss Pemberton may be unconventional, but she has a good heart. Theodore managed a weak smile. I know she does, madam. I've always known it. Clara led Theodore up the narrow staircase to the second floor where her small suite of rooms awaited. She had a sitting room, a bedroom, and a tiny kitchen area, along with a water closet she shared with the schoolteacher next door. It wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through her own labor, and she was proud of it. Once inside, Clara directed Theodore to sit in the worn armchair by the window while she lit the gas lamps against the afternoon gloom. The rain continued to patter against the window panes, creating a cocoon of sound that made the small room feel even more intimate. I'll get you some clean clothes, Clara said, moving to a trunk in the corner. They belong to my brother Daniel. He left them here when he went to work on the railroad out west. They should fit you reasonably well. Theodore watched her with an expression that was difficult to read. Your brother. I remember you speaking of him. How is he? Well, last I heard, he writes occasionally. Clara pulled out a shirt, trousers, and a wool vest, all neatly folded. He's working as a surveyor now, helping to map routes through Colorado. He's happy, I think. Happier than he ever was in Boston. Some people need distance from their past to find peace, Theodore said quietly. I envy him that. Before Clara could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Burke's son, Michael, a strapping young man of 19, entered carrying 2 large buckets of steaming water. Clara directed him to the water closet, where there was a hip bath that could be filled for bathing. Michael made several trips, hauling hot water until the bath was adequately filled, then departed with a respectful nod. Mrs. Burke herself appeared shortly after with a tray containing a large bowl of soup, fresh bread, butter, and a pot of strong tea. I'll leave you to your business, she said, setting the tray on Clara's small table. But Miss Pemberton, do remember that I run a respectable house. I'm aware, Mrs. Burke. Thank you for your kindness. Once they were alone again, Clara turned to Theodore with practical efficiency. Bath first, then food, then we talk. Those are the terms. Non-negotiable. Theodore nodded, too exhausted to argue. He rose from the chair with visible effort and made his way to the water closet. Clara handed him the clean clothes and a bar of good soap. Take as long as you need. I'll wait here. As the door closed behind him, Clara moved to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked street below. Her mind was racing with questions, with possibilities, with concern for the man who had once been her trusted friend and confidant. What could have happened to reduce Theodore Blackwell to such a state? He had been on the verge of a brilliant career, engaged to be married to Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of another prominent Boston family. His future had been assured, gilded, perfect, and now he was bathing in her water closet, wearing clothes borrowed from her absent brother, about to eat soup provided by her landlady's charity. The reversal of fortune was so complete, so devastating, that Clara's detective's instincts told her there had to be more to the story than simple bad luck or poor choices. Nearly an hour passed before Theodore emerged. The transformation was remarkable. Clean-shaven, with his dark hair washed and combed back from his face, wearing clothes that actually fit him, he looked much more like the man Clara remembered. He was thinner than he had been, certainly, his cheekbones more pronounced, his frame gaunt beneath Daniel's borrowed shirt, but the fundamental handsomeness was still there. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to truth. He was perhaps 32 or 33 now, Clara calculated, though hardship had etched lines around his eyes and mouth that made him appear older. Sit, Clara commanded, gesturing to the table where the food waited. Eat slowly. Your stomach won't be accustomed to rich food after days of near starvation. Theodore obeyed, sinking into the chair with a grateful sigh. He ate the soup with careful deliberation, forcing himself to take small spoonfuls, despite what must have been ravenous hunger. Clara poured tea for both of them and sat across from him, waiting patiently for him to finish. She had learned during her years as a detective that the best way to get someone to talk was to make them comfortable first, to show them kindness before asking difficult questions. When the bowl was finally empty and Theodore had consumed 2 thick slices of bread with butter, he sat back and met Clara's gaze directly for the first time since she had found him on the library steps. I suppose you want to know what happened, he said quietly. I want to know everything, Clara replied. But only if you're ready to tell me. I won't force you, Theodore. Despite what I said earlier, I won't arrest you or compel you in any way. You're free to leave whenever you wish." "And go where?" Theodore asked with a bitter laugh. "Back to the library steps? To some other doorway in some other part of the city? No, Clara. You've shown me more kindness in the past few hours than anyone has in 5 years. The least I can do is trust you with the truth, no matter how ugly it might be." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his hands wrapped around the teacup as if drawing warmth and courage from it. "It began in the summer of 1892, he said finally. "I had just passed the bar examination and joined my father's firm. I was engaged to Elizabeth, planning a wedding for the following spring. Everything seemed perfect, exactly as it should be for a Blackwell. And then I was assigned to assist on a case involving the Ashton Manufacturing Company." Clara knew the name. Ashton Manufacturing was one of Boston's largest textile companies, employing hundreds of workers in factories along the river. The Ashton family was enormously wealthy and influential, with connections to banking, shipping, and politics. "The case seemed straightforward," Theodore continued. "A former employee was suing the company for injuries sustained in a factory accident. The man had lost 3 fingers in a loom and could no longer work. He was seeking compensation for medical expenses and lost wages. The company wanted to settle quietly, pay him a small sum to go away. My father had me drawing up the settlement papers." He took a sip of tea, his hands trembling slightly. "But something about the case bothered me. The amount they were offering was insultingly small, barely enough to cover the man's medical bills. Nothing for his future lost earnings or his pain and suffering. So I did what any good attorney should do. I investigated further. I went to the factory, spoke to other workers, examined the machinery, and what I found was horrifying, Clara. Absolutely horrifying." Clara leaned forward, her detective's instincts fully engaged now. "What did you find?" "The factory was a death trap," Theodore said, his voice hard with remembered anger. "Safety mechanisms that were supposed to be in place were removed to increase production speed. Workers were being forced to operate dangerous machinery for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day with no breaks. Children, Clara. Children as young as 8 years old working in those conditions. And the accidents. The man who lost his fingers was just one of dozens who had been injured or killed over the past several years. The company had been paying off families quietly, always small amounts, always with agreements not to speak publicly about what had happened." "That's unconscionable," Clara said, feeling her own anger rising. "Surely your father, once he knew the full extent—" "My father knew," Theodore interrupted, his voice flat. "When I brought my findings to him, showed him the evidence I had gathered, the testimonies from workers, he told me to destroy it all. He said the Ashtons were important clients, that making such accusations would destroy the firm's reputation. He ordered me to complete the settlement paperwork and never speak of what I had discovered." Clara could see the pain in his eyes, the agony of that moment of realization when the father he had admired and respected revealed himself to be complicit in terrible wrongs. "But you couldn't do that," she said softly. "You couldn't just bury the truth." "No, I couldn't," Theodore agreed. "I went to the newspapers instead. The Boston Herald, specifically. I gave them everything. Documentation of the safety violations, testimonies from workers, records of previous accidents, and the pittance paid to victims' families. I thought I was doing the right thing, Clara. I thought I was serving justice." "You were," Clara said firmly. "What happened then?" Theodore's expression grew even darker. "The story never ran. Somehow the Ashtons learned what I had done. Their connections ran deep, all the way to the Herald's publisher. My evidence disappeared. The workers I had interviewed suddenly refused to speak, claiming I had misunderstood or misrepresented their words. And then Judge Marcus Ashton, the patriarch of the family, paid a visit to my father." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Judge Ashton was one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts, a federal judge with the ability to make or break careers with a word. "My father was given a choice," Theodore continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Denounce me publicly, claim I had fabricated evidence and acted unethically in an attempt to extort money from the Ashton family, or face the complete destruction of his firm and his own reputation. Everything he had built over 40 years, gone in an instant. And he chose to save himself," Clara said, understanding dawning. "He did more than that," Theodore replied bitterly. "He went to the Bar Association and filed a complaint against me himself. The hearing was held in private, but the Ashtons made sure the outcome was made public. I was disbarred for unethical conduct, accused of fabricating evidence and attempting to blackmail a respected family. My engagement to Elizabeth was broken immediately. Her father wouldn't allow her to marry a man who had been publicly disgraced, no matter how much she might have wanted to. Did she want to? Clara asked, curious despite herself. Theodore shrugged. I never knew. She wrote me one letter, saying she was sorry but that she had to obey her father. After that, nothing. And my own family. My father made it clear I was no longer welcome in the Blackwell household. My mother wanted to help me, I think, but she couldn't defy my father. My sister Margaret managed to slip me some money once, but she was discovered and forbidden from contacting me again. So you've been alone all this time, Clara said, her heart aching for him. For 5 years, Theodore. Living on the streets, surviving however you could. Not always on the streets, Theodore said. At first I had some money saved. I rented a room in a boarding house in the North End, tried to find work. But the Ashtons had been thorough. No one would hire me, not as a clerk, not as a laborer, not as anything. Word had spread that I was a liar and a cheat. Eventually, my money ran out. I lost the room, and I found myself exactly where you discovered me this morning. Clara was silent for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Her detective's mind was already working, sorting through the facts, identifying the key elements of the story. Theodore, she said carefully, you said your evidence disappeared, but surely you kept copies. Notes, documents, something. A flicker of hope crossed Theodore's face, the first Clara had seen. I did keep one thing, he admitted. A journal where I had documented everything. Dates, times, names of workers I interviewed, descriptions of the safety violations I observed. I managed to hide it before my father destroyed the rest of my files. It's been in a safe place all these years. Where? Clara asked urgently. At the library, Theodore said. The Boston Public Library. I have a private study carrel that I rented years ago before everything fell apart. The rental was paid in advance for 20 years, and I kept the key. I've been sleeping on the steps partly because I couldn't bear to be far from the last thing of value I possess, the only proof that I was telling the truth. Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Then we need to retrieve it immediately. Theodore, if what you're saying is true, if you have documented evidence of the Ashtons' crimes, then we can reopen the case. We can expose the truth and clear your name. Clara, no, Theodore protested, rising as well. You don't understand what you're suggesting. The Ashtons are too powerful. They'll destroy you just as they destroyed me. I can't let you throw away your career, everything you've worked for because of my past mistakes. They weren't mistakes, Clara said fiercely, standing up for what was right, trying to protect innocent workers from exploitation and danger. That wasn't a mistake. It was the most honorable thing you could have done. And I won't let that honor be forgotten or buried because powerful men decided that profit was more important than human lives. She moved closer to him, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, close enough to notice the way his breath caught when she stepped into his personal space. I'm a detective, Theodore. Seeking justice is what I do. And if there's one thing I've learned in my years with the police department, it's that the truth always matters, no matter how inconvenient it might be for the powerful. Theodore looked at her with an expression that was a mixture of admiration, concern, and something else, something deeper and more complex. You haven't changed, he said softly. You're still the same brave, stubborn, impossible woman I remember. The one who refused to accept that there were things she couldn't do simply because society said they were inappropriate for women. And you haven't changed either, Clara replied. You're still the man who valued justice over convenience, truth over comfort. That man is worth fighting for, Theodore. Your name, your reputation, your future, all of it is worth fighting for. For a long moment, they stood there in the lamplight, the rain creating a steady rhythm against the windows. Two people who had found each other again after years of separation, brought together by chance and circumstance and something neither of them could quite name. Clara felt her pulse quicken, felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea she had drunk and everything to do with the man standing before her, with the connection they had shared years ago, and that now seemed to be rekindling like embers fanned into flame. All right, Theodore said finally. We'll retrieve the journal. But Clara, you need to understand what you're getting yourself into. The Ashtons won't simply allow us to expose their crimes without a fight. They have resources, connections, the ability to make problems disappear. If we do this, we need to be prepared for whatever they might throw at us. I'm always prepared, Clara assured him. Now the library will be closing soon, and Mrs. Whitmore will probably have guards stationed at the doors watching for you specifically. We'll need to be clever about getting inside and accessing your study, Carol, without being noticed. Theodore nodded, a ghost of his old confidence returning to his bearing. The Carrolls are in the basement level, in the rare book section. There's a service entrance that the staff use to bring in deliveries. If we time it right, we can slip in when the guards are busy with the main entrance. Excellent, Clara said, already planning their approach. She moved to her wardrobe and pulled out a dark cloak. It's still raining, which will provide good cover. And I have my badge, which should grant us access if we're questioned, though I'd prefer to avoid that if possible. The fewer people who know what we're investigating, the better. As she gathered what they would need, Clara felt a familiar thrill of excitement, the same feeling she got whenever she was on the verge of cracking a case. But this time, there was an additional element, something personal and profound that had nothing to do with professional satisfaction. This time, she was fighting not just for abstract justice, but for someone she cared about, someone whose suffering mattered to her in ways that went beyond duty or obligation. She glanced at Theodore, who was watching her with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with something warmer, more tender. In that moment, Clara understood that whatever they were about to undertake together, whatever dangers they might face in the pursuit of truth, they would face them as partners, united by shared purpose and a connection that had survived years of separation and hardship. The game was afoot, as the British detective stories she sometimes read liked to say, and Clara Pemberton had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially when the stakes were this high and the cause this just. She would retrieve Theodore's journal, she would expose the Ashtons' crimes, and she would restore the name and reputation of a good man who had been wronged by a corrupt system that valued power over people. And perhaps, in the process, she would discover that the friendship she and Theodore had shared years ago had the potential to become something deeper, something that could sustain them both through whatever trials lay ahead. The rain had intensified by the time Clara and Theodore made their way back toward the Boston Public Library, transforming the streets into rivers of mud and refuse that threatened to swallow the unwary. Clara had insisted that Theodore wear one of her brother's better coats, a charcoal gray wool that was slightly too short in the sleeves but made him look respectable enough to avoid immediate suspicion. She herself wore her darkest cloak, the hood pulled up to shield her face from both the weather and any prying eyes that might recognize her. They approached the library from the rear, as Theodore had suggested, moving through the narrow alley that ran behind the massive stone building. The service entrance was partially hidden behind a stack of wooden crates, and Clara could see lamplight spilling from a window above, suggesting that some of the staff were still inside, cataloging returns or preparing for the next day's operations. The door should be unlocked until 7 o'clock, Theodore whispered, checking the watch that Clara had lent him from Daniel's possessions. It's 6:20 now. We have perhaps 40 minutes before the building is secured for the night. Clara nodded, her hand moving instinctively to the small revolver she carried in a concealed pocket of her skirt. It was a Smith & Wesson Model 1, chambered for .22 caliber cartridges, hardly a formidable weapon, but enough to give her confidence in dangerous situations. She had never yet fired it in the line of duty, but she practiced regularly at a shooting range in Dorchester, determined to be prepared for any eventuality. Theodore tried the service door handle, and it turned easily, just as he had predicted. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit corridor that smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and the peculiar mustiness that seemed to permeate all libraries. Clara could hear voices from somewhere above them, the murmur of librarians going about their closing duties, but the basement level appeared to be deserted. "This way," Theodore said softly, leading her down a narrow staircase that descended even deeper into the building's foundations. The temperature dropped noticeably as they went lower, and Clara pulled her cloak tighter around herself. The gas lamps here were turned down low, creating pools of shadow that seemed to shift and move as they passed. The rare books section occupied a series of interconnected rooms on the lowest level, each one lined floor to ceiling with glass-fronted cases containing the library's most precious volumes. First editions, medieval manuscripts, collections donated by Boston's wealthiest families over the decades. And tucked away in a corner, almost invisible unless one knew where to look, was a row of private study carrels, small wooden cubicles with doors that could be locked, reserved for scholars engaged in long-term research projects. Theodore produced a key from his pocket, tarnished with age but still functional, and fitted it into the lock of Carrel number 17. The door swung open with a creak that sounded unnaturally loud in the hushed silence of the basement. Inside, the Carrel was exactly as Theodore had left it 5 years ago. A small desk, a chair, a lamp that still had oil in its reservoir. And there, in the bottom drawer of the desk, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and decay, was a leather-bound journal. Theodore lifted it out with reverent care, his hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped it. Clara moved closer, watching as he opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his, neat and precise, the careful script of someone trained in legal documentation. She could see dates, names, detailed observations, everything Theodore had described. "May I?" she asked, and at his nod she began to read. What she found made her blood run cold. Theodore had been meticulous in his investigation, documenting not just the conditions at the Ashton factory, but also the systematic cover-up that followed each accident. He had recorded conversations with workers who described being threatened with dismissal if they spoke about injuries. He had obtained copies of death certificates that listed causes of death as natural when the deceased had clearly died from industrial accidents. He had even tracked down families who had been paid off, noting the amounts and the legal language used to silence them. But most damning of all were the entries from July 1892, when Theodore had discovered that Judge Marcus Ashton himself had personally ordered the removal of safety guards from the machinery, claiming they slowed production and cut into profits. There were quotes, apparently transcribed from a letter Theodore had seen in his father's files, in which the judge explicitly stated that worker safety was an acceptable sacrifice for industrial efficiency. "This is extraordinary," Clara breathed, turning page after page. "Theodore, this is enough to bring criminal charges, not just civil liability but actual criminal prosecution for negligence and manslaughter. If it becomes public, we both need to be very careful," a new voice said from the doorway. Clara spun around, her hand going to her revolver, to find a figure standing in the shadows just outside the Carrel. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought they had been discovered by one of the Ashtons' agents, that somehow their investigation had already been compromised. But then the figure stepped forward into the lamplight, and Clara recognized the face. It was Elizabeth Morrison, or rather, Elizabeth Morrison Ashton, as she had become, Theodore's former fiancée, who had married Judge Ashton's nephew, Robert Ashton, less than a year after breaking her engagement to Theodore. She was 30 years old now, still beautiful in the way that wealthy women could afford to be, with golden hair arranged in the latest fashion, and a gown of deep burgundy silk that probably cost more than Clara earned in 6 months. But there were shadows under her eyes, and her mouth was set in a line that suggested unhappiness rather than contentment. "Elizabeth," Theodore said, his voice strangled with shock, "what are you doing here?" "Following you," she replied quietly. "I've been following you for weeks, Theodore, ever since I saw you on the library steps and realized you were still in Boston, still alive. I thought—" She paused, her composure cracking slightly. "I thought you had left the city, started over somewhere else. Finding you like this, reduced to such circumstances, it's been eating at me." Clara's detective instincts were immediately suspicious. "How did you know we would be here tonight? How did you know about the journal?" Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Clara, and there was a flash of something, recognition perhaps, or assessment. "I remember you. You're the woman Theodore used to meet at the Athenaeum, the one who wanted to join the police force." "Clara Hartwell, wasn't it?" "Detective Clara Pemberton now," Clara corrected, her hand still resting on her concealed weapon. "And you haven't answered my question." "I didn't know for certain," Elizabeth admitted, "but I know Theodore." "I knew that if he had been staying so close to the library all this time, there had to be a reason. And I remembered that he had rented a study Carrel years ago, back when we were still engaged. It seemed logical that he might have hidden something here, something important enough to risk being arrested for vagrancy rather than abandon." Theodore took a step toward her, his expression a mixture of hope and caution. "Elizabeth, why are you here? If you've come to warn us away to protect your husband's family, I'm here to help you," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice fierce. "Do you think I don't know what they did to you? What my own father did, what the Ashtons did? I was forced to marry Robert, Theodore. forced by my father to ally our family with theirs, to cement business relationships and social connections. But I never forgot what you tried to do, the justice you sought for those workers." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. "These are financial records from the Ashton Manufacturing Company, documents that Robert keeps in his study at home. He's not very careful about locking things away when he's drunk, and he's drunk most nights. I've been copying them for months, waiting for an opportunity to do something with them, to find some way to make things right." Clara took the papers, unfolding them carefully. Even her untrained eye could see the significance of what Elizabeth had provided. These were ledgers showing profits from the factory, alongside expenditures for incident management, clearly euphemisms for the payoffs made to families of dead or injured workers. And there were correspondence files, letters between Judge Ashton and various city officials, suggesting that building inspectors and safety officers had been bribed to overlook violations. "This corroborates everything in Theodore's journal," Clara said, excitement building in her chest. "With both sources of evidence, we have an airtight case. Elizabeth, do you understand what you're risking by giving us these documents?" "I understand perfectly," Elizabeth replied. "I'm risking my marriage, my social position, possibly my freedom if the Ashtons decide to accuse me of theft. But I can't live with the guilt anymore, Detective Pemberton. I can't sleep at night knowing that people continue to die in that factory while I wear silk gowns and attend society parties. And I can't bear knowing that the man She stopped, her eyes moving to Theodore. That a good man was destroyed for trying to do what was right. Theodore was staring at Elizabeth as if seeing her for the first time. "You could have spoken up 5 years ago," he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only sadness. "You could have stood by me when I needed you most." "I know," Elizabeth said, tears welling in her eyes. "I was weak, and I've regretted it every day since. My father controlled me then, controlled my mother, controlled everything. He threatened to institutionalize me if I defied him, to have me declared mentally unsound. I was terrified, Theodore, but I'm not that frightened girl anymore. I'm a woman who has learned to be cunning, to be patient, to wait for the right moment to act." Clara watched the exchange between them with a detective's objectivity and a woman's intuition. She could see the history there, the old affection that had never quite died despite years of separation and betrayal. She could also see the pain on both sides, the wounds that had never properly healed. But personal feelings would have to wait. They had evidence now, compelling evidence that could bring down one of Boston's most powerful families. The question was how to use it without getting themselves killed in the process. "We need to move quickly," Clara said, taking charge of the situation. "Elizabeth, does your husband know you're here?" "No. He thinks I'm visiting my mother. She'll cover for me if necessary." "Good. Theodore, we need to make copies of your journal, multiple copies. If something happens to the original, we need backup evidence, and Elizabeth's documents need to be secured as well." Clara's mind was racing, planning several steps ahead. "I have a contact at the Boston Globe, a reporter named Sarah Mitchell who's been trying to break into investigative journalism. She's trustworthy, and more importantly, she's ambitious enough to run with this story, even if it means going up against powerful interests." "The press?" Theodore said slowly. "Of course. If we make this public, make it impossible to bury, then the Ashtons can't simply make us disappear the way they've made other problems disappear." "Exactly," Clara agreed. "But we need to be strategic. We release the story with enough evidence that it can't be dismissed as lies or fabrication, and we do it in such a way that multiple papers pick it up simultaneously. The Globe, the Herald, the Transcript. If it's everywhere at once, no amount of influence can suppress it." Elizabeth nodded eagerly. "I can help with that. I know people at several papers, society connections that the Ashtons don't control. I can ensure the story spreads beyond just Boston to New York and Philadelphia papers as well." "Then we have a plan," Clara said. "But there's still a significant risk. The Ashtons won't take this lying down. Once the story breaks, they'll come after all of us with everything they have. We need to be prepared for legal retaliation, possibly even physical danger." "I'm not afraid," Theodore said firmly. "I've already lost everything once. I won't lose my integrity a second time, and I've made my peace with whatever consequences might come." Elizabeth added, "My marriage was already hollow. At least this way, it will have served some purpose." Clara looked between them, these two people who had been broken by injustice and were now ready to fight back. She felt a surge of admiration for them both, and something more personal for Theodore. A growing awareness that the feelings of friendship she had once harbored had deepened into something richer and more complicated during their reunion. But there was no time for such reflections now. They had work to do. "We'll start tonight," Clara said decisively. "Theodore, you'll stay at my lodgings where it's safe. Elizabeth, go home and act as normally as possible. Tomorrow morning I'll contact Sarah Mitchell and arrange a meeting. We'll give her everything and she can start preparing the story. With luck, we'll have it published within the week." "What about your position with the police?" Theodore asked with concern. "Won't this investigation create problems for you? You're taking a significant risk as well, Clara." Clara smiled, a fierce expression that made her eyes flash in the lamplight. "The Boston Police Department hired me to investigate crimes and seek justice. That's exactly what I'm doing. If Chief Inspector Thorne has a problem with that, then he's welcome to dismiss me. But I won't stand by and let corruption go unchallenged, not when I have the power to do something about it." As they prepared to leave the library, carefully securing the journal and Elizabeth's documents, Clara felt a sense of rightness settling over her. This was what she had become a detective for, not to chase pickpockets or investigate petty thefts, but to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, to bring light to dark places where powerful men thought they could act with impunity. And as Theodore's hand brushed against hers in the darkness, as their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding and purpose, Clara knew that this case had become about more than just justice. It had become personal in ways that transcended professional duty, connecting her to this man who had suffered so much and yet retained his essential goodness and honor. They emerged from the library into the rain-soaked night, three unlikely allies bound together by a common cause and the determination to see it through no matter the cost. Behind them, the massive stone building loomed like a temple to knowledge and truth, and ahead of them lay a battle that would test everything they believed about courage, integrity, and the power of ordinary people to challenge the mighty. The game had truly begun now, and there would be no turning back. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of frantic activity and mounting tension. Clara had arranged for Theodore to remain at her lodgings, despite Mrs. Burke's increasingly pointed questions about the propriety of the arrangement. To maintain appearances, Clara had explained that Theodore was a witness in an important case who required police protection, which was true enough, even if it wasn't the complete truth. Sarah Mitchell, the reporter from the Boston Globe, had proven to be everything Clara had hoped for and more. A woman of 35 with sharp gray eyes and an incisive mind, Sarah had listened to their story with growing excitement, her pencil flying across her notebook as she documented every detail. She had examined Theodore's journal and Elizabeth's financial records with the thoroughness of a seasoned investigator, asking pointed questions that helped Clara see connections she had initially missed. "This is bigger than just the Ashton Manufacturing Company," Sarah had said during their second meeting, held in a discreet tea room in Cambridge, far from Boston's prying eyes. "If Judge Ashton has been bribing city officials to overlook safety violations, then the corruption extends into the municipal government itself. We're talking about a scandal that could bring down not just one family, but an entire network of complicit parties." Clara had felt a thrill of vindication at those words. This was exactly the kind of systemic injustice she had dreamed of fighting when she first joined the police force. But the scale of it was also daunting, even frightening. Sarah had moved quickly, working with her editor to prepare a comprehensive exposé that would run across multiple editions of the Globe. She had also, true to Elizabeth's promise, arranged for simultaneous publication in newspapers in New York, Philadelphia, and even Chicago. By the time the Ashtons realized what was happening, the story would be too widespread to suppress. But the Ashtons were not without their own resources and intelligence networks. On the third day after retrieving Theodore's journal, Clara returned to her lodgings to find Mrs. Burke waiting for her in the hallway, her face pale with worry. "Detective Pemberton, there were men here earlier asking about your guest," the landlady said in a hushed voice. "Rough-looking men, not the sort I'd want in my building. They claimed to be from the police, but they didn't show badges, and they asked their questions in a way that made me uncomfortable. I told them nothing, but I fear they'll return." Clara's blood ran cold. "When was this?" "About an hour ago. They left when I said you weren't here, but Miss Pemberton, I'm concerned. If there's trouble brewing, I need to know about it. I have other tenants to consider." "I understand, Mrs. Burke, and I'm grateful for your discretion," Clara said, already moving toward the stairs. The situation should be resolved very soon. I promise you, there's no danger to your other tenants. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding. Theodore was supposed to be safe in her rooms, working with Elizabeth to cross-reference dates and names in the journal against her financial records. If the Ashtons had sent men here, if they had somehow discovered where Theodore was hiding. Clara burst through her door to find Theodore and Elizabeth both safe, though clearly alarmed by her dramatic entrance. They were seated at her small table, documents spread before them, Elizabeth's hand resting near Theodore's in a gesture that spoke of growing closeness. "We need to leave," Clara said without preamble. "Now. The Ashtons know you're here, or at least they suspect it. We're not safe anymore." Theodore stood immediately, his face grim. "How much time do we have?" "I don't know." "Minutes, maybe an hour at most." Clara was already gathering the documents, stuffing them into a leather satchel. "Elizabeth, you need to go home. If your husband discovers you've been meeting with us—" "It's too late for that," Elizabeth interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Robert knows. He came home drunk last night and accused me of betraying the family. I think someone saw me at the library, or perhaps leaving the tea room in Cambridge. He didn't hurt me, but he locked me in my room. I only escaped this morning by bribing the maid." Clara cursed under her breath. "Then you're in as much danger as we are. The 3 of us need to disappear until Sarah can publish the story. Once it's public, we'll have some protection from public scrutiny. They can't simply make us vanish if the entire city knows who we are and what we're exposing." "Where can we go?" Theodore asked practically. "Every hotel in Boston will be watched. The train stations, the harbor, all the obvious exit points." Clara thought rapidly, running through options. Then an idea struck her. "I know a place. There's a settlement house in the North End, run by a woman named Catherine O'Brien. She provides shelter for working women and immigrants. The Ashtons would never think to look for us there, and Catherine owes me a favor from a case I helped her with last year." Within 15 minutes, they had gathered everything essential: the journal, the financial records, changes of clothing, and what little money they had between them. Clara left a note for Mrs. Burke, apologizing for the abrupt departure, and including 2 months' rent to compensate for any trouble. Then they slipped out the back entrance, moving quickly through the narrow alleys that Theodore had learned to navigate during his years on the streets. The settlement house was a 3-story brick building tucked between a bakery and a tailor's shop, its windows glowing with warm lamplight despite the late afternoon gloom. Catherine O'Brien, a formidable Irish woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the commanding presence of a general, took one look at Clara's face and ushered them inside without questions. "You'll be safe here," Catherine said, leading them up to a small room on the 3rd floor. "We house 40 women at any given time, and the Ashtons have no influence in this neighborhood. The people here remember what it's like to be powerless, and they protect their own." "Thank you, Catherine," Clara said gratefully. "We won't need to stay long, just until you can bring down those bastards who've been killing workers for profit," Catherine finished bluntly. I know who the Ashtons are, Detective. I've buried 3 girls who died in their factories, and I've comforted countless others who lost fingers or hands to their machines. You do what you need to do, and don't worry about imposing. This is exactly what this house is for, protecting those who stand up against injustice." That night, huddled in the small room with Theodore and Elizabeth, Clara reviewed their situation. Sarah had sent word that the story would run in 2 days, on Sunday morning, when newspaper circulation was at its highest. They just needed to stay hidden until then, but the waiting was agonizing. Clara found herself pacing the narrow confines of the room, her detective's mind spinning through scenarios, anticipating what the Ashtons might do, how they might try to stop the story or discredit them before it could be published. Theodore, noticing her agitation, stood and gently caught her hand. "Clara, you need to rest. You've barely slept in 3 days." "I can't rest," Clara said, but she didn't pull her hand away. "Theodore, if something goes wrong, if they find us before the story runs—" "They won't," Theodore said firmly. "And even if they do, what we've done matters. We've exposed the truth. Even if they silence us, Sarah has copies of everything. The story will get out." Clara looked up at him, at the face she had come to know so well over these intense, dangerous days. Somewhere along the way, her determination to help an old friend had transformed into something deeper. She had fallen in love with Theodore Blackwell, with his integrity and courage, with the way he had maintained his essential goodness despite everything he had endured. "Theodore," she said softly, aware that Elizabeth had tactfully retreated to the far corner of the room to give them privacy. "When this is over, when your name is cleared and the Ashtons are brought to justice, what will you do?" Theodore smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face, making him look younger, happier, more like the man he had been before his world fell apart. "I suppose I'll need to find a new profession, since I can never practice law again. But Clara, wherever I go, whatever I do, I'd like you to be part of it. These past days with you, fighting alongside you, have reminded me what it feels like to hope for the future. You're the bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain, but Clara stepped closer, eliminating the distance between them. "And you're the most honorable man I've ever met," she finished for him. "Theodore, I care for you. More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances, but I can't help it. You matter to me. You matter to me, too," Theodore said, his voice rough with emotion. "You always have, Clara, even when I thought I'd never see you again. Finding you again, being given this chance to make things right. It feels like fate." They stood there in the lamplight, hands clasped, gazes locked, and Clara felt the world narrow to just the two of them, to this moment of connection and understanding. Slowly, Theodore raised his hand to her face, his fingers gentle as they traced the line of her jaw. Clara's breath caught, and then, as naturally as breathing, they came together in a kiss that sealed everything they had been feeling, but hadn't yet spoken. It was a kiss of promise and hope, of two souls recognizing each other across the divide of hardship and time. When they finally drew apart, both were trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion between them. "When this is over," Theodore whispered, "when we're safe and free, I'm going to court you properly, Clara Pemberton, with flowers and poetry and all the romantic gestures you deserve." Clara laughed softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. "I'll hold you to that promise, Theodore Blackwell." The next day passed in anxious waiting. Elizabeth spent much of the time writing letters to her mother and her sister, explaining what she had done and why, preparing them for the scandal that was about to engulf the family. She seemed at peace with her decision, even relieved, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Saturday evening, as the sun set over Boston's rooftops, Sarah Mitchell arrived at the settlement house with the advance copy of Sunday's Globe. The headline read, "Ashton Manufacturing, a legacy of death and corruption." Below it, in smaller type, "Exclusive investigation reveals systematic safety violations, worker deaths, and government bribery." Clara read the article with growing satisfaction. Sarah had done masterful work, presenting the evidence clearly and compellingly, naming names and citing specific incidents. She had included testimony from workers who had finally agreed to speak on record, emboldened by the knowledge that their stories would be heard. And she had reproduced key pages from Theodore's journal and Elizabeth's financial records, making it impossible for anyone to claim the story was fabricated. "It's perfect," Clara said, looking up at Sarah with genuine admiration. "This will change everything." "It already is," Sarah replied. "My editor has been fielding inquiries all day from other papers wanting to run their own follow-up stories. The district attorney's office has been alerted, and there are rumors that federal investigators might get involved because of Judge Ashton's position. This is going to be the biggest scandal Boston has seen in decades." Sunday morning dawned cold and clear, the rain finally having moved on, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming in the autumn sunlight. Clara, Theodore, and Elizabeth emerged from the settlement house to find newsboys on every corner, hawking copies of the Globe and shouting about the Ashton scandal. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. By noon, crowds had gathered outside the Ashton Manufacturing Company's offices, demanding justice for the workers who had died. By evening, Judge Marcus Ashton had been summoned before a federal ethics committee to answer questions about the bribery allegations. And by Monday morning, arrest warrants had been issued for multiple Ashton family members and the city officials who had accepted their bribes. Theodore's disbarment was reviewed and overturned within a week, the Bar Association issuing a formal apology for their rush to judgment based on insufficient evidence. Theodore's father, Harrison Blackwell, made a public statement expressing his regret for his actions and asking his son's forgiveness, though Theodore told Clara privately that true reconciliation would take time, if it came at all. Elizabeth filed for divorce from Robert Ashton, citing irreconcilable differences and his family's criminal conduct. The divorce was granted with unusual speed, the judge clearly wanting to distance the court system from any appearance of protecting the Ashtons. Elizabeth's father, chastened by public opinion and his daughter's courage, finally acknowledged that he had wronged her by forcing her into the marriage. As for Clara, she became something of a celebrity within the police department and beyond. Chief Inspector Thorne, recognizing which way the wind was blowing, publicly praised her investigative work and announced the formation of a new division focused on corruption and white-collar crime, with Clara as its first detective. But for all the public accolades and professional success, what mattered most to Clara were the quiet moments she shared with Theodore in the weeks following the scandal's exposure. True to his word, he courted her properly, with walks through the public garden, dinners at respectable restaurants, and yes, flowers and poetry that made her laugh and blush in equal measure. 6 months later, on a spring morning when the city was alive with the promise of renewal, Theodore and Clara were married in a small ceremony at Old South Church. Elizabeth served as Clara's maid of honor, having become her close friend through their shared ordeal. Catherine O'Brien attended, along with Sarah Mitchell and even Mrs. Burke, who had forgiven Clara for the disruption to her boarding house once she understood the full story. Theodore had found new purpose as an advocate for labor reform, working with unions and progressive politicians to strengthen worker safety laws across Massachusetts. It was work that paid modestly but satisfied his soul, allowing him to use his legal knowledge in service of the justice he had always believed in. Clara continued her work as a detective, now leading investigations into the corrupt practices that exploited the vulnerable. And in the evenings, she came home to a small house in the South End that she and Theodore had purchased together, a place filled with books and laughter, and the deep contentment of two people who had found each other against all odds. On their first anniversary, as they sat together in their parlor, Theodore reading aloud from the newspaper while Clara worked on case files, he paused and looked at her with the same wonder he had shown on their wedding day. "Do you ever think about how unlikely this all was?" he asked. "That you would be the one sent to remove a beggar from the library steps? That of all the police officers in Boston, it would be you who recognized me?" Clara set down her papers and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I think," she said slowly, "that some things are meant to be. That the universe has a way of bringing together people who are supposed to find each other, even when the path is difficult and painful." "I'm grateful for that difficulty now," Theodore admitted, "because it led me here, to you, to this life we've built together. I wouldn't change any of it, Clara, not the suffering or the struggle, because it gave me you." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the warmth of his presence. Outside, the sounds of the city continued, the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the calls of vendors, the distant whistle of a train. But inside their home there was peace and love and the quiet certainty that they had fought for something worthwhile and won not just justice but happiness. The beggar outside the library had been noticed, his face recognized, his story told. And in the telling, 2 lives had been transformed, 2 hearts had found their home in each other, and the world had become, in some small but significant way, a more just and truthful place. Years later, when people asked Clara about the Ashton case, about how she had brought down one of Boston's most powerful families, she would smile and say it began with simply paying attention, with seeing what others overlooked, with recognizing the humanity in someone society had rendered invisible. But privately, when it was just her and Theodore in the quiet of their home, she would say it began with love, with the kind of love that survives separation and hardship, that recognizes its match even through grime and despair, that has the courage to fight for justice even when the odds seem insurmountable. And that, they both agreed, was the truest and most important story of all.